This is a conversation with Andrew Monaghan, a longtime Russia analyst and a very interesting and very contrarian voice in the Western debate about Russian strategy and power. A lot of Andrew's recent work focuses on a simple but uncomfortable idea that the West doesn't really misunderstand Russia because we lack information, but because we keep using the wrong lenses when looking at it. We tend to see Russia as irrational, tactical, reactive, or simply blundering its way through events, especially since the invasion of Ukraine. But Andrew argues something quite different, that Russia is actually highly strategic, that it has a long-term view of where it's going and how it wants to get there, and that many of the things that look like chaos or incompetence make a lot more sense once you look at how Russian strategy is actually conceived and implemented. He is not defending Russia. Andrew is fully supportive of Ukraine and unequivocally opposed to Russia's war, but he argues that Russia is more successful in pursuing its goals than what the mainstream consensus might say. In this conversation, we talk about whether Russia really has a grand strategy, what that strategy is, and what is it trying to achieve, and how the war in Ukraine fits into it or doesn't. We get into Russian geoeconomic thinking, mobilization, maritime power, or why focusing only on battlefield performance might be misleading when thinking about where Russia is and where it is heading over the next decade, and how successful it is in pursuing its strategy. Throughout the conversation, we disagree with each other a lot, and even now, I'd say that I still disagree with much of what he says, but it nevertheless makes you think and question some of the long-held assumptions about Russia that we have. And so I think it's really worth listening to. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes and additional bonus content. And if you want to get even more geopolitical analysis, I also write a newsletter. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast officially.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So, as I've mentioned before, we just started recording. You've obviously worked on Russia for several decades, and to me, it seems that a lot of your work or your writing, especially in recent years, has been quite focused on pointing out what you consider to be misconceptions or misunderstanding of Russia and of Russian politics, Russian strategic thinking, Russian military thinking by the West and by Western observers and analysts. And I want to talk about all these areas and talk about it more specifically. But maybe to start, what do you think, if we're looking at all of that, what do you think that are some of the biggest misunderstandings that we tend to have when looking at Russia across these areas?
Well, thank you for this wide-ranging question. I mean, some of what I do obviously relates to the discussion we have amongst ourselves as Euro-Atlantic examiners or Euro-Atlantic analysts of Russia and thinkers and policymakers and decision makers. So yes, I do discuss in some of my work how we think about Russia, what we maybe look at, what we don't look at also. And then, but also a large part of it tries to look directly at what's happening within Russia and then shape towards that too. So what I try to look for are points within Russia that we don't in Russian strategy making, in the Russian doctrinal debate and so on that perhaps we don't look at. And that, for instance, I've started to look for the last 6 or 7 years at Russian maritime power, for instance. I started to look maybe 10 years ago at Russian mobilization preparation. So what I was trying to do is not so much to have is point out misconceptions as to try to look at what else is going on and make a contribution to our discussion. And you'll be aware, for instance, the long-running discussion Kennan contributed to this, said more or less the same thing. Frank Roberts, the same thing in the mid to late 40s. That discussion about does Moscow have a strategic horizon, or is it tactical in outlook? I think is a useful starting point. That's the starting point I had. It's remarkable that many of the same questions that they had to deal with are the same questions that we're dealing with. So it's not really so much that it's misconceptions. It's how do we shape useful and practical answers to long-standing questions, and what else can we introduce to the discussion that helps us to interpret Moscow's activity?
To look at things that most people might not be paying that much attention. Well, why don't we start there? Because I wanted to get to it at some point, but since you've proposed the one of the questions that you're have been working on and you have been dealing with, whether Russia has a strategic horizon, whether Russia has a grand strategy, what that is, and whether the current leadership, maybe if someone like Putin is a strategist, or whether he's someone who just opportunistically responds to what's going on. What's your view?
Okay, well, my view is yes, Moscow is strategic in its outlook. So, and there are two points for this that I think are worth considering. First, I suppose the obvious one, that Moscow for the last 20 years has made considerable explicit effort to be strategic in its outlook. It's rhetorically said that they're interested in creating long-term strategy, grand strategy, shaping strategy. It's then created a landscape to create that legislation and those documents. It's then created a lot of strategic planning documents and sought to implement them. It's sought to resource them. So, there is a strategic agenda. There is a planning process, a strategic planning and creation process. On the one hand, we don't have to take that necessarily, but Moscow thinks it's strategic in outlook. First point. The second point is that this is really about an analytical lens. I mean, you could say you could change out Russia from this. You could insert China or Japan or the US or Czechia. What it is an analytical lens. And you can look here at Laurie Friedman. You can look, all of the Beatrice Heuser, Hugh Strawn. There's a strong discussion about what is strategy. And there are certain definitions about what strategy is. Colin Gray, you'll be familiar with the big thinkers. And we can take it back, of course, through Little Hart and Mahan and to Clausewitz. So we have an idea of what we think strategy is, and that in many ways can be distilled down to, it is an executive process of generating plans and seeking to implement them. So the question then, on this basis, because we can see that Moscow has assumptions about the future on which it builds plans, which it tries to resource and which it seeks to implement. So on this basis, there is an answer to our question. There is a strategy. So the question isn't whether there is a strategy. The question becomes whether it's good strategy, bad strategy, inaccurate strategy, flawed strategy. And that is where that intellectual lens helps us, because it enables us to fillet the process within Russia, the policy-making process, as I say, about assumptions, about planning, about resource and implementation. And we can take those 3 or 4 different parts of strategy making and then analyze them quite clearly. And we can see which bits work and which bits don't. And often it's not a question of Moscow having a goal. It's a question of the power generation process. So we're using our Euro-Atlantic definitions for this, in order to try to interpret Moscow's power. Now, a good riff off that would be to say that Moscow doesn't define strategy in quite the same way as us. They think grand strategy is a Western concept. Fine, but their own concepts of mobilization, mobilizatia, are remarkably synonymous with our idea of grand strategy. So I hope that's given some sort of at least starting point answer that we can pursue.
Right. Well, I think it has, but I think we need to sort of take it a bit step by step to explain that a little bit more. I think for start, what do you mean by saying that Moscow has its own power generating system, or what I forgot which exact word you use.
So the state, I mean, various parts of the state. I mean, you can take the Kremlin, the government, and different aspects of the policy making landscape shape assumptions about the future. They have views about the international condition, the domestic condition within Russia, where they think the world is going, where they think Moscow fits within that, on which they then build a series of plans. And there are many plans produced. We're not just talking foreign policy concept. We can talk strategy for the development of the Northern Sea Route 2035, the new plans that are being, the new strategy for the development of the Navy to 2050. There are lots and lots of plans, and you can see when you observe Russian policy-making debates and activity, you can see this explicit effort to shape those plans built on those assumptions, and then seek to implement it. So it's that policy generation process that our Euro-Atlantic definitions of strategy set out as what is strategy, that process. And we can then trace Russian discussions about the future. We can analyze their papers, their strategic documents, and then we can analyze their efforts to implement it and resource it. And we can say, well, these are the priorities, these are the problems, this is remarkably persistent and consistent. These are consistent aspects of dysfunction within the system. And we can, I know we have only limited time, but we can spend the rest of the hour talking about dysfunctionality within the Russian strategy making system. It doesn't mean that there is no strategy. It means that the strategy is A, difficult, and B, difficult to implement, and often dysfunctional.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about why there seems to be more and more war and conflict all around the globe, why it's not just a feeling but actually a verifiable fact, and why the increase in war can be explained with a niche mathematical theory and the plot of Jurassic Park, and what it means for the future of geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. Well, I guess you could argue that there's maybe a difference, or I understand what you're saying as that Russia is strategic and thinks strategically because it has strategic documents and plans and that kind of a institutional layer. But I guess you could say that many European countries, many countries around the world have strategic documents. Almost every country has a national security strategy, defense strategy that they update on some kind of yearly basis. But that doesn't necessarily mean often you have a document on paper, but no one actually follows it. So it's a strategy in theory, but not necessarily in practice. Would you say that in Russia it's different, that it doesn't stay just on paper, but they actually follow through?
Yeah. I mean, for me, strategy is not about what happens on paper. Strategy is about the effort to implement those plans. So it's about those three aspects, about what international conditions are, how the leadership anticipates the future, how they then shape plans on those assumptions, and then actively seek to conduct the orchestra, to organize resources to implement those plans. And we can see there's a lot of effort to implement these. There's lots of oversight. There's lots of reorganization of the system to explicitly try to implement those plans. So it's an important point you raise. Two points is that when you track the activity within Russia, we can see this generating process, and we can see that this isn't about a plan being fulfilled 100%. This is about a process of trying to generate power, and the efforts made, whether it's through the establishment of supportive mechanisms, through the establishment of super-institutional organizations to try to coordinate resources, whether it's the appointment of federal locomotive individuals to try to shape and improve implementation. But your point about all sorts of states having this is exactly right. And when we look at this, it's a deliberate attempt to say, well, what is universal and what is distinctively Russian? And as you'll notice, I've not said anything yet distinctively Russian. I'm observing that we have our standards for what strategy is, our definitions for what strategy is, and we can say, okay, Prague has strategic documents, London has strategic documents, and then we can test whether those capitals try to implement them or not. I'm saying the same stands for Russia. It's not, Moscow is explicit that it is trying to generate strategy, but through our own definitions and analysis, we can say, well, actually, yeah, we can see that they are trying to do it, and it's often dysfunctional, but it is also persistent.
To make it a bit more practical, what in your view, what is that Russian grand strategy that they are putting out and that they are following?
Well, the goal is, over the last 10 years, the goal reasonably explicitly, I mean, okay, the agenda is being set out persistently in May decrees in 2012 and 2018. I mean, it's a wide-ranging agenda that would take us probably several podcasts to even begin to touch on. But what you're looking at in distilled essence is an attempt to create a state that is resilient in the face of long-term geoeconomic competition, a state that is resilient in terms of the increasing likelihood of conflict and contest, and a state that is busy preparing itself for a shift of power in international affairs towards the Asia-Pacific region, as Moscow calls it. So it's very much about developing internal resilience, but also trying to shape aspects of pre-positioning in international affairs. So pre-positioning in important parts of the globe. And we can see this playing out both diplomatically, economically, even the use of armed force to a degree is related to this. I think we have that sense of watching resources being organized and shaped towards this. And again, please don't hear me say that I'm not saying that strategy means harmony and coordination and everything works and everything fits in. That no one who's ever tried strategy since Alexander the Great has ever had that. Just on a definitional aspect. What we are saying is, if you interpret Moscow's assumptions about the future, and you then read and interpret the plans and follow how they seek to implement those plans, you get a degree of foresight in where Moscow thinks it's going. And we can see that, for instance, in the shape towards a more maritime world. Large parts of the Russian economy now go out by ever larger parts go out by sea. And you see a significant effort over the last decade, incidentally accelerated since 2023, to enhance the sea power of the state. So there are important practical aspects of this which are visible demonstrations of that effort to generate power.
Well, to maybe apply that to obviously the most visible aspect of applying this power, which is currently the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine, which, to my understanding, was kind of surprising to a lot of Russia experts and Russia watchers, because it was kind of counterintuitive to what many assumed Russia would do and what Russian strategy would look like, or what would happen if Russia would follow its own strategy. So maybe let me ask you, if you're applying this studying the strategy and then gaining a certain foresight out of it, were you surprised by that development, and how does that, you think, fit within the context of Russian grand strategy?
Well, the answer is I wasn't terribly surprised by it. We were writing about it with colleagues and discussing it with colleagues in the UK, the US, and NATO. You could, if we track through, for instance, some of the work I've been doing recently about Russian strategic culture and the Russian use of force over the last 100 years. Actually, it fits very, very squarely within a Russian tradition or Muscovite tradition of strategy making, and the use of armed force. both in terms of how it reads the international environment and how it seeks to use that force, and indeed the flaws within that. So what we're talking about, for instance, is the characteristics of the Specjalna Wojenna Operacja, the special war operation, are very familiar to those who look at Soviet Moscow's campaign against China, against Japan in the second half of the 1930s, Finland, Poland at the end of the 1930s, Manchuria, Budapest, Operation Danube, of course, in 1968, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Georgia. So there are very similar aspects to this of how Moscow has sought to use its military power. Likewise, many of the characteristics of the Russian deployment of military power are exactly familiar. Problems, a big gap between politics, the political decision-making, and the military resourcing in order to achieve that. We can quote a variety of senior Russian officers, but let's stay with Mahmoud Gariev for the time being, who repeatedly said Moscow's politicians almost invariably give the military a bad starting point. Right? So there's a gap between politics and military. Then there's a gap between resources dedicated by the state to the waging of that campaign. There then happens to be, as we can see, problems in command and control, problems in logistics. So in many ways, actually, the campaigning against Ukraine since 2022, but actually also 2014 and prior to that, reflects very much part of Moscow's strategic culture. And I think if you interpret the horizon of what Moscow is seeking to do, i.e., protect and increase its access to the Caspian, the Caucasus, the Sea of Azov, and the Black Sea, where a lot of the economy goes out via the sea, you see this effort that is again a sustained effort. Moscow has campaigned since 1991, has campaigned south. It's campaigned in the Caucasus, obviously Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine in 2014, Syria. All use of military force, formal state force, has been on that north-south corridor. So for me, it wasn't hugely surprising, shocking, and saddening. No, surely doesn't need to be said, but surprising technically. Not so much, neither for the act nor for the flaws within it, and this I think is why it's worth looking at strategy. Strategy isn't to say Putin is a master strategist. This is not what I'm saying at all. Strategy is a process that is persistent but often flawed and dysfunctional. And again, one can use strategic culture, Russian own strategic culture, to look into the flaws of it, to look into squander, waste, disharmony within different ministries. So that's why I say it's a useful lens for examining Russian power, because it helps as an interpretive tool to explore continuity, change, and shape towards forecasting. And I would just to finalize that point, I would say we tend to look at Moscow as a military power. I think an awful lot since, particularly since the mid-2000s. Much of Russian strategy has been geoeconomic in its underpinning. It's about diversifying its economy. It's about about building relations further afield. It's about, in fact, Moscow's horizon in the post-Cold War era has been geostrategic in character, and again, very explicitly stated so, but also explicitly in the conduct of it. And I think this is probably amongst the most important aspects of Russian strategy. We look at Ukraine and we think this is an indication of Russian strategy, but it's instructive to see what else is going on and where this sits in the overall horizon. And I think really Russian strategy is to position Moscow as a commodity champion.
Well, but isn't that quite a fundamental paradox then? Because if the focus of Russia's strategy is much more geoeconomic and position it as a commodities champion, and it's not really a military power primarily, then what it has been doing for the past 4 years was basically the exact opposite of what the strategy should be achieving, because it was destroying its economy and its geoeconomic goals and also doing everything it can to hurt its position as a large salesman of commodities.
That certainly looks like it from a European perspective. Obviously, I mean, and considered London, and I can agree with you on this absolutely. I would offer at the same time that if you track Russian commodity exports and you compare them to where they were in 2019, and you take it before this renewed assault on Ukraine, in fact, Moscow as a commodity champion has diversified to a larger number of countries, and it's deepened its footprint. So in some senses, actually, no, what you see is an acceleration, not a course change. And this is why I think it's worth looking into and exploring again that use, that context of military power is one aspect of Russian state power. And I think you asked at the beginning about misconceptions. And I think one of the misconceptions that in the Euro-Atlantic community became an orthodoxy and then it became a dogma was that in many ways Moscow's strategy was almost synonymous with its form of hybridity, and I think that allowed us to misinterpret how Moscow views the use of armed force. It also allowed us to actually miss the scale of Moscow's effort to diversify its economy. And I think if you explore, for instance, and dig into the sale of substantial quantities of hydrocarbons, agricultural products, nuclear products, and weapons, these have all grown since the early 2010s because of a specific and deliberate planned intent to do so and the resourced intent to do so. And not only have they grown since the 2010s, that accelerated in the wake of what were at the time, don't forget, quite serious sanctions in 2014, 15, 16, and then again accelerated from 2022. I will keep saying this, I'm sure, all the way through. Please do not assume that because Moscow tries to generate strategy, that makes everything a nice, coherent, master strategic stroke. We're all aware of government policy in every country where governments try to create a form of strategy, and then they're buffeted by events. They make a mess of it. They conduct paradoxical policies. But this shouldn't allow you to be distracted from the fact that Moscow has increased its export of commodities since 2022 and compared with 2019. And that increase of sale of commodities has gone to a wider group of states and then increase again that number of commodities sold. So look, as a Brit, I can sit and agree with you. It looks like it's fundamentally hurt the Russian economy. And then you look at other indicators like Russian purchasing power parity. You look at Russian manufacturing. You look at the role that the defense industry has played in changing internal purchasing power. You look at the acceleration of export relations and diversification of export relations. So I'm a little bit cautious about the fact that campaigning in Ukraine has derailed Russian strategy. From Moscow's point of view, right or wrong, it's we can say as a Brit, I can say, well, they've made a colossal strategic mistake, and there are many people in London who would agree with me. The fact is, there are many people in Moscow who disagree with me and have pressed the accelerator on strategy, not course change.
Well, I do think it's an interesting perspective, and I think it's an interesting to experiment to focus more on how it seems from a perspective of sitting in Moscow rather than in London. But I think have to count or argue one thing that didn't seem to be present in this analysis is that, yes, Russia did diversify its exports to many other parts of the world, but it also lost the European market, which was a very fundamental part of its geoeconomic strategy. So I guess if you diversify, you gain some new markets, but you also lose a really giant one that you've had up until now. That's not a great diversification.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, I'm conscious that when we talk about Russia, there are certain things that, as a Brit, I look at Russia and think, why would they do this? And you say they've lost their European market. I'm going to invite an open rhetorical question for you to have a look and dig around and see see which European states have decreased their consumption of Russian commodities and which have increased them since 2022. Not all states in Europe have decreased their consumption of Russian commodities. Sure, some have. Also, you're I'm sure aware and have thought extensively about how various actors across the world have sought to let's call it dilute, but also evade the sanctions. So economic relations have continued in certain aspects. It's not that there's been lots of companies withdrew. Absolutely. We can see that. Lots of sanctions have been imposed on the Russian economy from the European side, essentially cutting Moscow off from a certain range of economic interaction. At the same part alongside this, please keep in mind the increasing consumption of Russian commodities in Europe, in certain European states, and look at the ways about how Europeans and Russians have evaded the sanctions. I will keep the focus again on the fact that Moscow set up in the 2010s a good example of strategy and action, in my view, set up in the 2010s a form of diversification for hydrocarbon export. I'll give you the example. It's Russian investment in oil sales to India. This didn't happen in 2022. This happened because they specifically planned to compete for deep water ports in India. They outcompeted the Chinese and the Saudis, and they were able to locate and establish a deal with to have a deep sea port in India in the mid 2010s. And then, of course, because this is a huge market and a growing market, not only in India, but it's a lily pad into the wider region. So it's a very good example of strategy in action that also, in my view, reaped its rewards in 2022 when Moscow had to start looking to accelerate its diversification. Again, just going to say it each time, this doesn't mean it's good from my point of view. This is a problem from our point of view. But if we're to try to deal with a set of challenges, and Moscow is explicit that it's in structural contest with the Atlantic community, we have to be aware and we have to be attempting to interpret how Moscow seeks to conduct that contest. And if we continue to say that Moscow is tactical and reactive and making things up ad hoc, we don't understand the costs that Moscow is willing to pay for its priorities. We don't understand the intent of where it thinks it's going. So therefore, we can't deter it. I mean, and I often pose this, okay, if we talk about the flaws, I mean, honestly, we can do this. Dominic, I know you know the situation well enough. You and I can talk about the flaws within the Russian system all day long. The halatnost, нерешительность, I mean, negligence, indecision. We can chart this. We can even put cultural aspects into this about the absurdity of the system not working. All of this is true. But so is the persistent effort to preposition Russia in international affairs, to create resilience within the economy and society as a whole, and to then start to play a greater role in international affairs, which is part of a global contest. So, and that is extremely disagreeable for Euro-Atlantic politicians, on the one hand. But again, it is explicit that Moscow is in contest with us. That's what makes this important. And I would even say that we talk about a new era. I mean, our politicians, I'll mention British ones because I don't want to widen the observation, but we talk about the fact that we're in a new era because of the renewed campaigning against Ukraine. Whether we are, I mean, those who follow Russia will know that new eras come along remarkably frequently these days. We had New Era in 2018, we had New Era in 2014, and so on and so forth. But one of the problems that we have is that we talk a new era, but then we use the old foundational thinking, the old concepts and the old language and the old reference points for talking about Russia. And I think unless we have mentally in our mind's eye 2030, we're already missing part of the problem. And we tend to look backwards with regards to Russia for all sorts of good reasons. And Moscow often uses the historical symbolism and historical arguments and the like. But strategic planning in Moscow is already taking shape out beyond to 2035 and beyond. And that's where we need to be looking if we're going to deter this very explicit challenge. Honestly, I think we're missing the changing characteristics of Russian power. By that I mean the maritime aspect that I already mentioned, the mobilization preparation that has clearly been underway for a while, but which we seem resilient to look at. The attempt by Moscow. We continue to talk about Russia for good ways and good reasons as that Russia is a failed democracy and is an increasingly authoritarian state. I'm sure that you and I both know we've been having this conversation for 20 years. I think if we don't know the answers to this now, fair enough. But for me, if you want to see where Moscow is shaping where it's going, you're looking at a deliberate and very explicit effort to create a sovereign military patriotic fortress. And that means the mobilization preparation of material, but also spiritual and patriotic capacity, technical capacity. So we're missing its dilemmas, Moscow's strategic dilemmas, but we're also missing the changing characteristics of Russian power.
So maybe to make that a bit more specific, when you're talking about mobilization to turn Russia into a sovereign fortress, what does that, because that is fairly abstract, what does that actually mean? What would Russian leadership institutions, this strategy, want Russia to look like in 2030 or 2035? And what especially from the perspectives of what does that mean for us? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you. Since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.